Hey guys, Engineot here again, and it's time for us to gain another point of insight. Today we're talking about Dark Souls 2 and Scholar of the First Sin, hence the title, A Tale of Two Sequels. So, Miyazaki's talking about Dark Souls 3 with the term withered beauty, but the sad thing about that term is it just as equally applies to Dark Souls 2 in a holistic sense, and Scholar of the First Sin. So, let's go into what that means. When I say holistic, I mean taking an entire image of a product. So Dark Souls 2, looked at holistically, means we're combining our knowledge of its development, its developers, its lore, its mechanics, everything. Our entire picture of Dark Souls 2, in a holistic sense, needs to be discussed, including Scholar of the First Sin. So I'm going to put a TLDR link right here. If you want to skip to the end of the video and get to the meat of things, like get to the this is what it's about stuff, then click on it. You know what? Doesn't even bother me. I'm going to be talking for a little while. So if you want to skip right to the end, you got 3 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second. All right, time's up. You're here. Keep watching. To set up our understanding of Dark Souls 2, I'm going to read a quote from director Yui Tanimura. And the reason I'm reading this quote is because it elucidates so much about Dark Souls 2. And it's really forthcoming, which is really rare for Japanese developers. You don't see a lot of Japanese developers own up to problems. You know, you don't see a lot of Japanese people own up to problems. And that's an Asian thing. It's very much embedded in Japan and Korea as well. And when I lived in Korea, when I was teaching English there for about 2 years, I had the same exact kind of thing happen, where people just did not know how to admit fault, because if they admitted fault, it was like admitting weakness. But Yui Tanimura is a pretty humble guy, just like Miyazaki, and I think this quote says a lot about him. So here we go. When asked, was developing Dark Souls 2 as difficult as it sounds, Tanimura had quite a lengthy reply. Yes, this game actually went through quite a troubled development process. Due to a number of factors, we were actually forced to rethink the entire game midway into development. We had to go back to the drawing board and think once more about what a Dark Souls game should be. It was at that point I took on my current role, overseeing the entirety of the game, including the art direction. To ensure that we created a game both we and the fans wanted, it was completely necessary, but it did of course create a problem. We had to decide what to do with the designs and the maps that had already been created up to that point. Ideally, we'd start again from scratch, but of course we were under time constraints, so instead we had to figure out how to repurpose the designs in our newly imagined game. This meant everything from deciding new roles for characters to finding ways to slot locations into the world map. This unusual development cycle faced us with an entirely different set of problems, and looking back on the development as a whole, it was at times arduous. Although I'm convinced that none of this will be felt by the players, and I'm completely satisfied with the final product, so while I don't think the need to dwell on it too much, in the interest of giving a full count of the development process, it's something we can't avoid touching on. I want you to think and put yourself in the shoes of someone like Yui Tanimura. You're in charge midway through development of Dark Souls 2. Imagine there's been an entire game almost that's been made before you. You know, a bunch of assets that you don't have any artistic or design control of. And all of a sudden you have to restart the game. You have to make this whole pack of stuff that's been made by this entire team. You have to make it still matter because they've spent a year or two of their life on it. Like, it's not easy, but when Tanimura says that he hopes and he thinks that Dark Souls fans won't see that this happened, we can. And the astute people who go in and look at Dark Souls 2 and say, why is this game the way it is? It's the way it is because of these factors, and Tanimura did his darndest to try and cover these tracks. He tried to make sure that we felt like we were getting a game that was not reimagined halfway into development, but we did. So we have to talk about why that happened, but we just don't know. The simple answer is that when Dark Souls 2 was being developed at first, it just wasn't a Dark Souls game. And if you watch the first trailer and you listen to some of those early interviews, it doesn't feel like a Dark Souls game. Like what they talk about and what they explain, and they want to, they wanted a more character focused and story driven game that's easier to understand. They weren't making a Dark Souls game. The whole point of Dark Souls is subtlety. And they tried to recapture that subtlety, but they failed in a lot of ways. This doesn't stop people like me from really appreciating Dark Souls 2, and especially what Tanimura did. Tanimura, that guy, man, I have no idea how he pulled off and made such a coherent game midway through development. Like, we give him a lot of crap, and a lot of it's undeserved, because he basically had to take an oil painting and paint over it to make it a better painting. Like, imagine how hard that is when you're corralling a team of hundreds of employees, potentially. So, a couple of factors made Dark Souls 2 the way it was in development. It was structural inconsistency with how they had to fit all these areas into one another, and items. That's also a big thing. It was an incomplete development vision, because they basically shifted priorities halfway through and had to restart. They had to cut a lot of content that would have been in the first draft, and they had to cut a lot of content that would have been in the second draft. So we're getting this weird hodgepodge of things that they just were constrained by their time frame, and that's the third thing. When you're operating on a development time frame, we can't all be The Last Guardian. We can't take like 8 years to come out and hopefully be really good. It just doesn't work that way, especially for a company that needs to keep their bottom line going, because From Software is a big company. They need a revenue, and they're doing better than they have before, so they're trying to support more team members. Now, that doesn't excuse them putting out a compromised final product, but Dark Souls 2 was far from completely compromised, and it was totally playable. So let's move on. We can see all this kind of disjointedness that happened in development manifest directly in the game. Another example from when I lived in Korea. Korea was a country that like rapidly modernized in the 70s and the 80s. And when they built their houses in Seoul, they was really just the Wild West. They just built stuff on top of stuff, and it looked super crazy and ramshackle. And by building things that way, they showed in this weird kind of visual sense the spirit of the times, like very little regulation. Things are just popping up everywhere and going up. You need to build up. We need to build more. We need to build it quicker. And in the same way, you can see the structural inconsistencies in Dark Souls 2 manifest in its mechanics, and they also manifest in the game itself in terms of the structure of where things are, where items are, how places are placed, and storylines. That's another big thing. So from here, we're going to move firmly into gameplay, story, and lore. And specifically, we're going to talk about lore first, because it's kind of what I'm good at. There's one thing that demonstrates absolutely the problem with Dark Souls 2's lore for me. And this is the person who likes Dark Souls 2. The biggest problem with Dark Souls 2 is symbolized by Ornstein, or Old Dragonslayer, as he's come to be known in the Dark Souls 2 canon. And there's a couple reasons why I say this, but the first reason is that why? Why is he here? He's just so sad. Like, he's alone, he's in a place where there wasn't a dragon, and in Skullard now there's a dragon, a wyvern, and it just doesn't make any sense. Like, why is he here? So let's talk about this a little bit and further get to the meat of what this is and why this is a problem. Old Dragonslayer symbolizes almost everything that's wrong with Dark Souls 2's lore. He just is a loose tie back to Dark Souls 1. He's missing his other half. He's like a sad shell of what he used to be. And if you want to really kind of get down to brass tacks with how this is a complete metaphor, it just doesn't make any sense. Like, they're trying to shoehorn, and Tanamura tried. He's trying to shoehorn our understanding of Dark Souls 1 into Dark Souls 2, and it's very, very clearly just, hey, check it out, it's Ornstein. Like, it's almost irrelevant to the entire game as a whole, and it's really tragic that, Ornstein had to meet his end in Hade's Tower of Flame. And you could even go into like, oh, is it the real Ornstein? Is it a copy? What does this say about the cycle? It doesn't. It doesn't say about anything. It's just, here's Ornstein and he's black now. You can't really make a big call about Ornstein because there isn't anything that really pins him there. It's this sort of emblematic fault of Dark Souls 2, where they're just trying desperately to enforce upon you that this is a Dark Souls game. And they're not confident enough in their own vision to really make a Dark Souls game that they want to make. It's almost as if when Dark Souls 2 were first starting development, and when Tanamura had to come in and fix it, he wanted to make sure, Tanamura, that Dark Souls 2 was identifiably a Dark Souls game. And I can't really confirm that this is what happened, but I feel like he just put in all these Dark Souls 1 references to be like, oh yeah, totally, it's Dark Souls, obviously. Like, it's just a waste. And it creates confusion in people who are trying to understand the game because they're like, why is Ornstein here? This is crazy. I don't understand. Exactly. You don't understand because it doesn't make sense. But there's a larger problem with Dark Souls 2's lore, and that is the cycle. But I'm not going to say it's what it is. I'm not going to actually say the cycle is the problem, because I love the cycle. You know, I'm really big into Asia. My major in college was Korean studies. That went really well, by the way. And what ended up happening was when I looked at Dark Souls 2 and its lore, and I said, oh wow, cool, a cycle. That's actually a pretty awesome idea. Until they kept repeating it for 2 hours. Like, everyone and their dog and every item description you can find in the game, it feels like, has a description of the cycle, and they're like, oh, but in a long time ago, it wasn't called Dragonlake. I get it. I understand. You didn't have to do it this many times. In fact, you probably shouldn't have done it at all. You probably should have made it environmental. You probably should have said, oh man, you know, why don't you like go down and find something underground that's like, holy crap, this is Lordran, what the heck? And then you have to guess. Like, instead of doing this kind of cryptic Dark Souls style storytelling, where it's told through the environment and subtle hints and all these other little things, they just straight up tell you 800 times in dialogue and item descriptions that, yo, Dragonlake was like a different thing before, man. Can you guess what it was? It's just really, really clumsy. And a lot of Japanese stories have this problem to a lesser extent, Dark Souls. But, you know, if you look at a Final Fantasy game, you know, my issue with like that type of Japanese storytelling is just how it lacks any subtlety. There's no subtlety. It's like, these are these characters and they're feeling these emotions right now. Just direct. It's in your face. And in Dark Souls 2, they had that same problem with subtlety, except they applied it to the cycle. And the cycle was this thing that needed a lot more subtlety than it was given. You also run into another problem in Dark Souls 2, specifically with items, and that is that Scholar of the First Sin completely invalidated a ton of theories based on item locations. When Scholar of the First Sin came out, and it rebalanced all these like item locations and enemy locations, what it did was it basically said none of that mattered. All the things that we moved didn't matter. So any lore theories, any ideas you had about where these enemies were and why they were there, and all this stuff, it didn't matter. Why are all these Haydenites scattered all over Dragonlake? Apparently it doesn't matter because we've just moved them all to Hayd. Like, it was just silly, and it was sad because, like, I actually don't have a problem with Scholar of the First Sin, but if Scholar of the First Sin were the only copy of Dark Souls 2 that were released, I'd be pretty happy. Like, it's a really cool and complete product, but as something that just kind of went in and took a broom and was like, you know, all the stuff that we did, whatever. It obviously doesn't matter enough that we need to keep it. That's a little distressing because it basically invalidated a lot of what made that game, you know, kind of shine in the little ways that it shined, was that hopefully there was a story in there. And Scholar of the First Sin came in and was like, nah, not really. Like, no, it didn't really matter. That's why we changed everything around. It was just, you know, why not shuffle it? Like, it was just, it was indicative of the development problems making those things actually not matter at all. And it was really sad to see that. But another big problem with Dark Souls 2 that people had was the ending. They didn't like that you have one ending. They didn't like that it was just every single time you beat the game, it was the same ending. And I thought it was actually really cool. I actually thought that that was a really cool part of Dark Souls 2, that they were like, nope, it is the same ending, because it's a false dichotomy in Dark Souls 1 anyway, because no matter what, everything's gonna kind of equalize anyway. So why give the player an illusion of choice and just say, you know what, when you enter this thing, when you enter the Throne of Want, it is what you make of it. I thought that was incredibly brave, and I thought that it was like a really cool ending idea, and I was pretty happy with it. And then Scholar of the First Sin came along and was like, no man, there's a Dark Lord ending too. Like, oh, alright. I guess then you completely compromise your development vision again. You know, it's just, Dark Souls 2 has this problem where like they're just never confident in it. Like, it got a lot of flack when it was released, better fix it. Better make a whole new edition, as a matter of fact, after we released the Lost Crowns DLC, which, by the way, were really good. It's just sad. It's like, why do they feel the need to keep changing it? And it's because fans want feedback. It's not like quite the Mass Effect thing where they gotta make it like an entirely new ending because, man, that was terrible. It really is emblematic of the problem of Dark Souls 2 and the team not having a lot of faith in it as a product. Think about like the confident guy at school, and not the jerky confident guy, the nice confident guy. everyone likes that guy because he's just nice and he's confident and he's good to you and you're good to him and everything's hunky-dory because he's a good dude. And that's like Dark Souls 1. They had a lot of confidence in Dark Souls 1, given they patched it a few times and changed some stuff, but they had a lot of confidence in that game because they didn't go around and make new editions of it other than the one for PC, and that had additional content that they couldn't have put in the original game. You're showing a confidence in your story and you're not changing around stuff to make the story different, whereas Dark Souls 2, they changed item descriptions, item locations, enemy locations, they changed all this stuff because you could tell that they weren't confident in the product they were made, and that's probably a product of feedback and the development experience that team had making the game. So let's move finally into mechanics and some of the stuff that made Dark Souls 2 like as a functioning game really, really weird. And we got to start with the big one, which is soul memory. And soul memory is this reviled, like it's amazing how many people really hate soul memory. It's, you know, when I first heard about soul memory and they were very vague about it, they didn't explain quite what it was, I was super excited for it because here's why. I thought that soul memory was going to be this combined metric. It was going to be the souls you spent on your gear, and it was going to be the souls that you spent on leveling. And I thought that was going to combine to create a number that fit in a bracket that worked. And I thought, wow, that's really brilliant. They're accounting for gear level, which means that people who are going to twink, which is what the system was designed to counter, are going to get matched a little bit higher by default because they're spending money and they're spending souls on their gear, and that's being taken into account. I was completely wrong. Instead, it's every single soul you ever get. You know, it's like imagine if someone calculated your net worth as a person based on all the money you've had in your life combined. Doesn't change how much money you have right now, but all the money you have had over the course of your life, that's the number that apparently matters. It's insane. It's not a good system. And it creates a lot of problems, not for PvPers who find ways around it and now have the agape ring. So it doesn't cause a huge problem for them. Ironically enough, it causes a problem for the people it was designed to protect. As, you know, like diehard Souls fans, we tend to forget the people who kind of come in and out of the Souls series, like they just want to play it, they don't want to live the dream like we do. But those people who were just, you know, they were the target of soul memory, actually are the ones who are like the most baffled by soul memory as a system. You know, in Dark Souls 1, you could use a soul level calculator. You could just be like, oh yeah, you're within 10 levels of me, cool, let's co-op, if you and your friend wanted to get into a Souls game and play together. Soul memory means that completely is insane and doesn't matter. When you want to play with your friend in soul memory, you have to figure out what bracket you're in, how many souls you've got. If your friend and you have played up to the same point in the game, but you've done farming or you're not as good as he is and you've died a lot more, you could potentially be in entirely different soul memory brackets, and it makes it so that you can't co-op. Even if you're like the same exact level, you can't co-op. And it's really crazy because when people want to, you know, be playing with a friend and they want to make a low level character to play with a friend, you can't do it anymore because soul memory removes that possibility. So it's just bizarre. It doesn't make sense as a system, and it really kind of harms Dark Souls 2. Another really odd system was agility, which was, you know, it governed the amount of iframes you have in a roll. That was just misguided. There was a good idea there, and it was, you know, the idea of not tying this to that, and it had some kind of development core. There was a reason that idea existed, and it just didn't work in practice, because why would you do that? Now, the stated goal, as far as I'm aware, was to make sure that you don't have any like fat rolling Havels with the same amount of iframes as people in lower armor. So here's what you do. If you use heavier armor, you have less iframes. Much more, you know, straightforward fix. Now, I don't know if it's implementable in their engine, but it would have been something like that would have made more sense than having to level up a specific iframe stat. Like, it just seems super gamey and it takes you out of it. So, TLDR, Dark Souls 2 had a ton of development problems. It has a ton of issues with confidence in itself and its own storytelling and its lore and its own place in the Souls universe. It really doesn't understand where it is. Its cycle system is just overwrought and it's crudely implemented. Like, you could have had a great cycle and instead you just said everyone and their dog talk about the cycle. It was just lacking nuance. You also have this problem where it implements all this old Souls game material and it doesn't give it context, so it doesn't matter. A lot of things are an issue in that sense. So on top of all that, it has systems like soul memory that just don't work, and it has systems like, you know, iframes and agility that are just really wonky. and it just doesn't know what it wants to be, and the development team didn't have a lot of confidence in the product, it seems like, and that's why there's like 2 editions of the game, and that's a little disheartening. But I want to end with a little bit of a lighter note. In spite of all this negative stuff that I've said about Dark Souls 2, I love Dark Souls 2, and it's probably Stockholm Syndrome, but I'm gonna kind of explain why. Dark Souls 2 was the first game that I ever really waited for in the way I did, because, you know, when I played Dark Souls 1, I was super stoked. When Dark Souls 2 got announced, so I was very excited. Eventually I'll do a video on like my personal history with the Souls series, so it's a little bit more clear. But when Dark Souls 2 came out, you know, I was actually at a kind of training thing for Samsung. I worked for Samsung at the time, and I went to San Francisco on the same weekend that there was the Dark Souls 2 launch party. I was stoked. I was like, oh my god, I get to go to this Dark Souls 2 launch party after I'm done with this training event for Samsung. This is amazing. And I was so excited. I was like, oh my god. I organized this Reddit meetup for our Dark Souls 2. I got to meet a bunch of cool Redditors, and I got to meet Vati Vidya, which was awesome. He's a great guy. And then I got to play Dark Souls 2. I got to meet the president of Bandai Namco, and I got to have him tell me about the game, and it was just awesome. It was really neat. And to this day, that really affected me, and it really does color how much I like Dark Souls 2, because I had such a good time meeting people who were so passionate about the game. And it's really sad for me to see how Dark Souls 2 has become like the butt of jokes all the time. Like, it's, oh yeah, man, let's not count Dark Souls 2. Like, I don't think that that's really warranted. Dark Souls 2 has a lot of problems. It has a lot of things that make it not so great, and it's got a lot of systems that could be better, and it's got a lot of lore that's just as like, why? But you know, as a game, I've played a lot worse, and I think that it gets too much crap, and it gets maybe deserved or undeserved. That's a matter of opinion. But when you play Dark Souls 2, I want you to think in this holistic sense. I want you to think, why did this game turn out the way it did? And in spite of all the things that happened in this game's development, in spite of the problems that it has, am I enjoying it? Do I really like Dark Souls 2? And if the answer is yes, then you like Dark Souls 2. It's not this horrible burden you have to shoulder. You don't have to wear an armband that has the Dark Souls 2 logo on it because all of a sudden you're part of this horrible underclass that likes Dark Souls 2. It's a fine game. And if you like it, don't be ashamed of it. So remember when I mentioned the phrase that's being used in Dark Souls 3's development process, that like withered beauty quote? Well, the thing about that quote is that it describes Dark Souls 2 because Dark Souls 2 is what could have been a beautiful game that's been really withered by all of the things it's been through, its team has been through, the systems that it put into place, the systems that didn't work. It's this like tragic image of what Dark Souls 2 could have been. And in a weird sort of romantic way, it makes me like the game just as a product of its environment, and it teaches me a lot of things about the game industry and about development. So you can see it that way in that holistic sense or not. Like, you know, you could just not like to play it, and that's totally fine. But I wanted to leave you guys with this kind of interesting idea that Dark Souls 2 is just, it's just an interesting game. It doesn't have to be good, it doesn't have to be bad, it's just interesting. And I hope that you can kind of see what I'm trying to get at here, and I hope the video wasn't too long. In the end, the story of Dark Souls 2 is the story of the sequel that was, and the sequel that could have been. And when you look at it that way, it becomes a whole lot sadder, but you appreciate the game that came out so much more when you have a greater context as to why it is the way it is. If you stuck with me through the whole video, thanks a lot for watching, and I hope you got something out of what I said. If you skipped to the TLDR, not a problem either. I'm glad you enjoyed the video if you did, and if you do want to get more information, you can go back and get some more through what I explained in the video. Thanks for watching. This is Enjanaut, signing off.